A little pastime to begin this morning, and that is quite all right. Being able to talk with everyone, catching up with everyone. It is good to see everyone out this morning. And my name is Daniel Sanders, preacher for the Quail Valley Church of Christ, and we are engaging in our Bible study and continuing in our Bible study this morning. We are in Acts chapter 17. We began looking at this chapter last week, and we are going to continue. We looked at the first 11 verses. We're going to kind of pick up with verse 10 again, just kind of reviewing real quick and getting into the next part of our section of verses. And we'll look at that here in just a few moments. But before we begin, Brother Wayne, would you mind opening us in a word of prayer this morning? Thank you, Brother Wayne. So Acts chapter 17 is where we are at this morning. We are looking at Paul's second missionary journey. As you look, we began down here in Jerusalem, and down here in this southwest corner. And from there, this was in Acts 15. We kind of get up here into Antioch, where I've kind of labeled that as almost like a base for Paul, where he begins with his first two missionary journeys and kind of concludes at these. And then he kind of goes across into Cilicia, into parts of where he was at in his first missionary journey there in Derbe and Lystra, Iconium. Then kind of travels north. The Spirit, as we have talked about so far, has not allowed him to go this way because he got the Macedonian call. So he kind of goes up this way north into Bithynia, Pontus, and across into what we know as Thrace. And we have Samothrace, Neapolis, Philippi is what we talked about in Acts chapter 16. From there, Paul has continued as he has made some more conversions. There in Acts chapter 16, through the power of the gospel, we get into Acts chapter 17, where he was there at Amphipolis, and then also in Thessalonica. And where we are at right here this morning is Acts 17, verse 10 down to verse 15. Paul, he was dealing with a riot, a mob, as we look here in Acts 17 in Thessalonica. And so he had escaped and started continuing on his journey. And he's here in Berea. And we concluded there in verse 11 last week, where again, Paul, where does Paul go normally when he enters a city to reason and talk to individuals? Synagogue. Why does he go there? Religious people. Custom, we include custom in there, as was his custom. He would go and reason with these people because, again, that's where all religious people were coming together. And so as we look here, we get introduced to these people in Berea. It says that they were more fair-minded because, again, they're in Thessalonica. They heard the word, and there was a riot that kind of came about with all this. But what do we know about the people in Berea? What did they do when Paul reasoned and spoke the word to them? They searched the scriptures. What access or what scriptures did they have? Or find access to, I should say.
Probably most of the 5 books of Moses.
Have the 5 books of Moses.
Isaiah.
Have Isaiah. We know as we look at this, they have some of the different prophets as we look at these things. And not everybody had a complete set. Nobody ever had from, somebody said they had the Old Testament. Not everybody had, Genesis to Malachi, what we know it today. They had bits and pieces of different ones. And so the Berean Christians, they would search the scriptures. They would go and find whoever had whatever they had access to, and making sure what Paul was saying, what Paul and Silas and others were preaching, were according to the scriptures. Again, that fair-mindedness, being able to diligently study to show thyself approved to God, a worker who does not need to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth, 2 Timothy 2:15. And so they searched the word. to find out whether these things were so. And that's what we concluded with last week, is kind of opening up and learning a little bit about the Berean Christians in this, what we look at face value is kind of, think, oh, well, they just kind of search the Scriptures, kind of like how we search the Scriptures. No, there was a lot of effort. And I'm not saying that what we do today does not mean that we don't have effort, but we have accessibility. I think it's a word that we can say that we have more accessible resources, and quickly accessible, because we can be able to, we've had Bible studies, and I've seen Rick and I will be sitting there, we'll pull out our phone and sit there and start looking up on some different commentary, some of our Bible apps that we have, being able to look something up real quick if someone may be having a question, or trying to get a little bit more detail on something. We have accessibility to things, and we are able to use those resources. So again, the Berean Christians, as we look here, they studied the Word of God, they searched the Scriptures. And as we look at we'll read verse 12 down to verse 15, it says, "Therefore many of them believed, and also not a few of the Greeks, prominent women as well as men. But when the Jews from Thessalonica learned that the word of God was preached by Paul of Berea, they came there also and stirred up the crowds. And immediately the brethren sent Paul away to go to the sea, but both Silas and Timothy remained there. So those who conducted Paul brought him to Athens, and receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him with all speed, they departed." So the Berean Christians, they heard the word, they searched the Scriptures, and what was the results of things? You have Greeks. We could say in this situation maybe there was Greek nationality there, but again, we're looking at this as well in the more broader spectrum of things. Greeks being Gentiles. Gentiles believed, Greeks believed. And not only do we see this, but again, we have some detail here. Prominent women as well as men. Multiple amount of people were believing in the gospel. When we look at that word believe, now we've looked at it a couple times. There's a little bit more than just what we think of when it's believe, is it not? Usually when we look at these conversion accounts here in Acts, it's not just the simple, I believe Jesus, but it is the faith that one has. It is the conviction that one displays. That faith, as we look at, for instance, Hebrews 11:6, does not just mean the belief factor, but it is belief in God is part of it, and also the diligent seeking of God and His Word and His will. So when we look at this, we can make a conclusion with something that said there were more conversions happening here in Berea. But what happens? What happens with those brethren in Thessalonica, or the people, not the brethren, but the people in Thessalonica? They're envious, right? Why are those people in Thessalonica envious? Who did the gospel go to? Jews and Greeks, Gentiles. And how did the Jews there feel about things? Selfish. They didn't like that. They sure didn't like that as well, because again, the Jews were, or the gospel is reaching out and including not just Jews but Gentiles, and they were envious of it, willing to try to stop anyone at all costs. And here, again, as we look, very similar to what we read in Paul's first missionary journey when he was there in Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch of Pisidia. Here we got people coming from Thessalonica, may not be distantly as far, but these people, we could say they were zealous in what they were wanting to do. They were willing to go from Thessalonica to Berea to stir up the crowd, to try to get Paul and Silas to be silenced in some sort of way, whether it was prison or, as we look, even death. There's already been attempts at people wanting to try to take Paul's life already. And so they were willing to come down and try to stop Paul, Silas, and others at all costs. And so the people here, the brethren, knew this was happening, saw the stir up in the crowd, and they send Paul away first to Athens. And eventually, once he got there to Athens, then he called for Silas and Timothy to come with him and be with him there. Does anybody have anything to add before we get to the next part? interesting, you mentioned about, Gentiles being grafted in. Romans 11 also begins to talk about how the Jews, their branch got broke off because of their neglect, and then what's going to happen to them? They're going to be grafted. They're both going to be grafted in. Both of them. So really, as you look at, for instance, in Romans 11, they're common together now. They're both going to be, both of them were separated from the Father, and both can be grafted back in together with the Father. But they had that 1,500 years, 2,000 years of, we were first.
And we were special.
And we were special.
And God defended us.
Yeah.
God gave us many, many blessings because we were His special children.
And they were also the first ones to really feel the true wrath of God, too.
Those curses that I did not read in my sermon on Wednesday,
Yeah.
there are a lot of those.
Yeah.
It's like, 45 or so verses.
Right.
Verses.
Right?
And God didn't spare any of them.
No, He did not. And so, as we look at all this again, and it's a good observation of how the older son there, that prodigal son, of how he was upset that mercy was extended to his younger brother after him. I was faithful. I was here. Where's my fatted calf? Where's the gold ring on my wrist? Where's all that for me? What was the father? Look at that prodigal son. What's the father say to his son there?
You've been with me always.
You've been with me always.
Everything I have is yours.
And you still have a blessing if you will just stay with the Father. As we look at this, be like your son who has decided to come back to the Father. You've been faithful. Just have that mentality of wanting to stay with me and be with me, and there will be blessings that come from this. So we look and see it. So the Jews are zealous, or not. Well, they're zealous, but in kind of without knowledge sort of thing with how they treat Paul and Silas and Timothy, but also how they had been jealous and envious of the Gentiles being able to also receive, and the Gentiles are just eating this up so much. As we look, they receive that word with joy. They want to hear more on the matter. They want to continue to have Paul stay and preach, for instance, or Peter stay and preach to Cornelius and his household and to others. But there was a majority that had chosen not to feel that way, feel ill will towards it, and so Paul has in the safety and concerns of safety to get him away from this stirring up the crowds and this mob. Again, they send him to Athens.
These are city-states at this time.
Yeah.
So each one is kind of a rule unto itself.
Right. So who's the one that's in control of it all? Supposed to be in control, but they break it up into different. Each one is able to kind of handle their own situations. There was a certain person over Jerusalem. Remember, Pilate.
Yeah.
He was in control of handling situations there in Jerusalem. Then here in Paphos, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he was the governor that had hurt Paul and Barnabas. Not Festus, a different one. The one in his first missionary journey. Now, Festus was the one that was eventually the one when he was standing trial with everything. There in Cyprus, Sergius Paulus. There we go. Yeah, Sergius Paulus was the one that I was thinking of there in Acts chapter 13 in his first missionary journey. So you have different ones, as Rick has mentioned, that are in control over different areas, handling such measures, being able to handle things in their own city. Romans set this up where different officials were to be able to oversee such situations. So Paul's sent down there in Acts 17, and he is sent down into Athens, where we look and kind of see in his next part going down this way. It says that he was kind of staying near the coast at times on his trip down there. But as we look Acts chapter 17, verse 16 down to the end of the chapter is what we're going to focus on on this next part of his trip. And this is where he's in Athens. He's at the Areopagus or Mars Hill, eventually getting to there. But as we look at verse 16, let's look and read down to verse 21 first. It says, while Paul waited for them, waiting for Silas and Timothy at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him when he saw that the city was given over to idols. Therefore he reasoned in the synagogues with the Jews and the Gentile worshippers, and in the marketplace daily with those who happened to be there. Then certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers encountered him, and some said, "What does this babbler want to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods, because he preached to them Jesus and the resurrection." They took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new doctrine is of which you speak? For you're bringing up some strange things to our ears. Therefore we want to know what these things mean." For all the Athenians and the foreigners who were there spent their time in nothing else but either to tell or to hear some new thing. Paul arrives. In Athens. And his spirit is provoked. What does he see there in Athens? God's idol worship. You know, as we look in history, what does Athens kind of represent? If we look at other historical books or readings, what's there in Athens? Got the Greek gods, right? All the ones that you can read about: Zeus, Hermes, Aphrodite, Dionysius. You start naming all the different ones. It's kind of like an epicenter. It is the center stage of idol worship.
There were more idols in Athens than what the rest of Greece put together.
Yeah.
It's easy to find a god than to go to Greece.
And it's not, as we look here, is what Paul sees, it's not just that the Greek gods. You know, we're going to talk more about it as he looks to kind of jumping ahead just for a moment. What does he see? They have every known to their ability, known to their knowledge, a god of every type of background and everything they could think of, including, and again, we're talking about more about it here in just a little bit, the unknown God. Not only do we see him having these different ones, but the unknown God is also got an altar there, and that's what Paul's going to speak about. But so Paul, he sees there in the city idolatry. Now, what did they had that big Jewish, the Jerusalem council meeting there in Acts 15? What were some of the conclusions that they came to? What were they to refrain from? For, restraining themselves from certain foods and things offered to idols, and also just in general idolatry. Stay away from these things. Paul was delivering a letter from Jerusalem and came up into Antioch and other places we have just a little bit of reference to, of bringing what this conclusion was on how how Christians were to conduct themselves. Now again, as we look, he's not dealing per se with Christians in this practical, but he just sees people in general giving over to idols, practicing idolatry, worshiping these different things. So what's the first thing he does after he sees those things that we have record of? He goes where? He goes to the synagogue once again. And he reasons with these individuals. He reasons with Jews and with Gentile worshipers both. And then he goes into the marketplace. Now we've seen him go kind of out in the public, outside the synagogues already on a couple of occasions, one with Lydia, and there when he first got into Philippi. But here's we look, we have Epicurean, Stoic individuals, philosophers, that have encountered Paul, and they called him a babbler. Why do they call him a babbler? He is proclaiming about foreign gods because he's preaching about what in particular? Preach about Jesus and the resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus. Talking about, there's this one, he's preaching about that resurrection. I believe I was mentioning last week or a week before, Jesse, about what's your favorite chapter in 1 Corinthians? 1 Corinthians 15, right? Because that pertains to the resurrection, and it also makes application to us. And without that resurrection, what's our spiritual state? We're lost. They do. They bring him to the area opposite. It's not just kind of just putting him up there and putting him on trial, we don't burn you at the stake base. No, they want to hear what he has to say. Why do they want to hear what he has to say? What do the people, all people go there to what? Supposed to worship their idols, whatever it is they want to worship. That was kind of the epicenter of idolatry, but also people had come, Gentile Jews came together, they worshiped the different idols as well. But they spent time wanting to hear what? Something new. They want to hear what people had to say, and usually they want to either tell someone something new, look what I've learned, or they want to hear from someone else. What's that, Brother Jesse?
Seed picker, that's what it was. But he might have picked up something that we haven't learned.
Oh yeah, absolutely. They want to hear those. They wanted to hear those. Using the term loosely, they want to hear strange things to their ears. Strange meaning new. But also, not only did they want to hear, they wanted to hear the explanation as to why, and that opens the door for Paul. These individuals, they did not deny the existence of gods, but they also held human affairs were governed by fate. They have some very similar traits, just kind of just a little bit of Epicurean Stoics. They had a little bit of similarities with some of their backgrounds, and they held high to some of the different philosophers of the time, or even previous times. You know about Aristotle, for instance, yes, Seneca, other individuals that were followed at that point. So these individuals, they wanted to learn more. And here again, verse 22, as we continue on looking here, verse 22, it says, Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious. For as I was passing through and concerning the objects of your worship, I even found an altar with the inscription, To the unknown God. Therefore, the one whom you worship without knowing, him I proclaim to you, God, who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, since he gives to all life, breath, and all things. He has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as also some of our own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. Therefore, since we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, something shaped by art and man's devising. Truly, these times of ignorance God has overlooked, but now commands all men everywhere to repent. Because he has appointed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by the man whom he has ordained, and he has given assurance of this to all by raising him from the dead. You want to take note of first. And Jesus does this as well with the churches in Asia Minor. As well, Paul does it some in his letters that he writes to the churches and individuals. When he begins to talk here, or and to be able to preach to people about Jesus, he points out some good things and some good qualities that these people had, right? When you look at the churches in Asia Minor, what does Jesus do before he kind of gets into some of the meat and potatoes of why he's speaking to these churches? He points out some good things, does he not? What does Paul say about these individuals that are here at Marshall, that are here in Athens at this point? He says, you are very religious. They had several gods to worship. And what they had tried to do is to be all-inclusive with it, maybe in the wrong way, but nonetheless, he says, you're being inclusive. You're trying to make sure that you've covered every basis of gods, of religious worship that you can think of, and make sure that you cover every basis of such things, and being able to have this offering for those people to be able to come. Even, as you get in verse 23, as I was passing through, what does he say? He notices there's an altar to who? The unknown God. And what does Paul say he wants to do now? Let's talk about this one. The other ones have an identity factor to a certain extent. And then you got this one, to the unknown God. I want to proclaim to you the unknown God. And he begins off talking what? God in the beginning. He goes back to the very beginning, to the genesis of everything, no pun intended, but the very beginning of everything. God in the beginning made the world and everything in it. He is Lord of heaven and earth and does not dwell in temples made with hands. We're going to close with Genesis 1:1. What did God do in the very beginning? What does Genesis 1:1 say? In the beginning, God, what? Created the heavens and the earth, made all things, heavens and earth, and everything that dwells in it. Now you get from Genesis 1:1, then you get into chapter 2, all the way down to verse 31. It goes into detail of what he created. The sun, let me start over. Light, darkness, sun, moon, the waters, as we look, creeping things, the firmament, the sea creatures, the land creatures, the flying creatures, the creeping things. And then we have man, and also, as we see, God created woman. He has created all things from the very beginning. You know, these other gods that they had fallen down and worshipped to, they had a beginning point that was well after the God of heaven, the unknown God, as they have that altar to at this point. So anybody have anything you want to add real quick before we close? It's got about 10 seconds left. No pressure. We're going to go ahead and stop there. We'll continue looking at the rest of what Paul addresses here in Acts chapter 17 there in Mars Hill, and also the response of the people. Because as we look, when Paul gets there to Athens, he's preaching about the resurrection, and in his final remarks that we have there in Acts chapter 17 verse 31, he speaks about the resurrection. Again, this is what the resurrection is all about Jesus Christ being raised from the dead. So we'll talk more about the details in between more, Lord willing, next week. Thank you.